preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I want to thank you all for coming here, and I really want to thank the Y for inviting me. It is an incredible honor. I'm from Los Angeles, and even in Los Angeles, people have heard of the 92nd Street Y. And they're like, "You're speaking there?" It's like, yes, I've truly made the top echelon now of Jewish speakers having been invited to the 92nd Street Y. I can put this on my resume to impress. I don't know. I'll worry about someone who needs to be impressed, and then I'll tell them where I've been. So, and I thank you all for coming to hear me, and keep your questions percolating till the end. I want to start by telling you that Rashi actually we should hold up a copy of the book. Either one. There you go. I'm the author of Rashi's Daughters. Good. If this is not the book you were expecting, the Ethiopian people are down the hall. Anyway, I want to start by letting you know, of course, that Rashi is not anybody's name. Rashi is an acronym, R-A, rabbi, S-H, Shlomo, or the Hebrew for Solomon, I, Isaac. So he's Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac. Somebody, hundreds of years after he died, decided it would be a wonderful idea to name all the medieval rabbis with these kind of acronyms, which means we're stuck with Rashi and Rambam and Ramban and, Rashbam and Ribbon and all these people we can't tell one from the other without a scorecard. But Rashi himself is not responsible for calling himself that. In my book, which is Family Saga, he's Solomon or he's Papa. But I'm going to call him Rashi because that's what everybody calls him. Little background. Rashi was born in 1040 in Troyes, France, Troyes, which was the third largest city in France at the time, at the headwaters of the Seine, 100 miles east of Paris, the capital of the province of Champagne. And Rashi was a vintner, so you can kind of keep that all together of Rashi and Champagne. And Rashi died in 1105, which makes 2 years ago, 2005, Rashi's 900th yahrzeit, the 900th anniversary of Rashi's death. And I really pushed to get Rashi's Daughters, the first volume, published in 2005, to take advantage of all the hoopla there was going to be in the Jewish community, commemorating Rashi's 900th yahrzeit. At this point, you're looking at me blankly like everybody always does. What hoopla? You're looking at her. Actually, the JCC in Louisville, Kentucky, and Chabad in Pittsburgh did have programs on Rashi in 2005, and France had a €0.50 stamp. Thank you very much. But other than that, Rashi was pretty much ignored, which is a real shame because Rashi is not only one of the greatest Jewish scholars ever. I'm going to go on a small limb and say he is the greatest Jewish scholar ever. Certainly more Jews study Rashi's words every single day than all of the other Jewish scholars that exist put together. And that is because of the two things, Rashi's two big claim to fame. First of all, he wrote a commentary on the Torah, the entire Torah, not just the first 5 books, a commentary which is so authoritative that in every rabbinic school, from ultra-Orthodox to feminist reconstructionist, one of the first classes the students take is Chumash, the 5 books, with Rashi's commentary. It's probably the only thing those two rabbis have in common, is that they both studied Chumash with Rashi. The very first Hebrew book printed on a printing press was the Torah with Rashi's commentary. And for anybody who has ever seen Rashi script, and a lot more people have heard of Rashi script than you would think because it's in the Da Vinci Code, of all places, Rashi is not responsible for Rashi script. He didn't invent Rashi script. He didn't write it. The printer who printed this book hundreds of years after Rashi died wanted to make sure the reader didn't mix up the Torah text from the commentary, which actually was very common when people are handwriting manuscripts. So they cut out type, the little block Hebrew that we're used to, and that became the Torah text. And then there's this other squiggly stuff that he used ostensibly so that people wouldn't mix up the text. But I have been told that actually the Rashi script uses a whole lot less ink. And so the printer was trying to save money by doing this. And probably that's why every commentary in any Hebrew book, even written not by Rashi, uses the same script, because it's going to save the printer's ink today as well. This same printer 50 years later used these same types, it was the same printer, to print Rashi's commentary on the Talmud. And this is when we come to Rashi's true claim to fame, why people should have observed his yahrzeit in 2005. Because Rashi's Talmud on the Talmud commentary is so authoritative that nobody else has written one. All the commentators after this comment on him. And if you could not have Judaism as exists today without the Talmud. In case you haven't noticed, the stuff that is in the Torah, we're not exactly doing that anymore. We don't go to the Jerusalem 3 times a year and kill animals for our holidays. We have a synagogue, we have prayer books, we have an elaborate kashrut ritual, we have all kinds of rituals for our life cycle events. All of those are detailed in the Talmud. And the Talmud, you can't just pick it up and read it. Even if you were perfectly fluent in Aramaic, you couldn't read it. You would be able to read the words, but you wouldn't know what they were talking about. Because the Talmud is the oral law, and what's written down is missing a lot of words. It's a shorthand. It's designed for someone who has already studied this stuff with a teacher to help jog their memory. Well, Rashi helps jog your memory even more so by filling in the missing words, telling you if it's a question or an answer, and essentially making Talmud accessible these days. And it's been said that without Rashi, Talmud would be lost to the Jewish world. And without Talmud, I can't imagine what Judaism would even look like today, if it existed at all. So there you have it in 3 minutes, why we should have celebrated Rashi's 900th yahrzeit, and why this man is so important. But of course, my book is not Rashi. There's been plenty of nice biographies on Rashi. My books are Rashi's daughters. So how did I get into the idea of writing about these women that frankly most people have never heard of? In 1992, 15 years ago, I heard about a women's Talmud class in Los Angeles being taught by Rachel Adler, who's now a professor of theology at Hebrew Union College. And at that time, she had the amazing title of one of the foremost Jewish feminist theologians. If those words aren't oxymorons, that was her claim to fame. And she started a women's Talmud class. And I'll admit that I knew nothing about Talmud when I signed up for this class. What I knew, I had read The Chosen. That's it. So I knew there was such a thing as Talmud. And I knew that women weren't supposed to study it. And actually, the reason Rachel started this class was because in Los Angeles, 15 years ago, other than enrolling in rabbinic school, there was no place for a woman to study Talmud. Okay, I know in New York you guys have had Drisha since 1992, and there's women's yeshivot, and in Israel there's some places, but by and large, from the time the Talmud was written 1,500 years ago until now, women have been, you could say, prevented, excluded, forbidden. In any case, however you want to choose the word, women didn't study Talmud. And I'll grant you that that was one of the things that made it immediately attractive to me. As soon as you have to do is say, women aren't supposed to study this, and I said, I want to see what's in there. So I signed up for the class and had absolutely no idea what I was getting into, and I fell in love with Talmud. It became my passion. I have been studying now 15 years still. I study with a rabbi in Los Angeles who's on the rabbinic faculty at AJR, Academy for Jewish Religion in Los Angeles. And I study Talmud every week, all kinds of Jewish texts. And I hope the 1,000th anniversary of Rashi's birth will be in 2040. I'll be 90 years old. And I hope I'm still studying Talmud then, and that hopefully there'll be a little bit more interest in Rashi when we sing him happy birthday in 2040. So I started studying this class. And this being a woman's Talmud class, Rachel points out to us that Rashi, who's on every page, every line, has no sons, only daughters, and that these daughters are reputed to be learned, reputed to wear tefillin. And I was very curious, is this true? This is the 11th century. Were they really? I mean, are these just one of these legends that, floats around and nobody knows where it is? And so I decided to do some research and find out if this stuff was really true. Okay, I live in Los Angeles. We have 2 rabbinic schools. now it used to be UJ, now it's AJU, Hebrew Union College, we have UCLA, Claremont Colleges, USC, great research libraries. So I certainly had plenty of resources very close to me. And I quickly discovered that Rashi's daughters were indeed learned, that they wrote responsa for Rashi when he was ill towards the end of his life, that at least one of them, and we don't know which one of them, was teaching other women Torah in the town. We have responsa that are written from Rashi's granddaughters, which certainly no one would have written to them, asking them legal questions if they weren't learned. As for tefillin, I don't know if Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. I was never able to find out if they personally wore tefillin. But frankly, I'm not sure if Rashi personally wore tefillin. We don't have anyone there to report that. But I did find out that some women in Rashi's time wore tefillin. And some women in Rashi's time wore tzitzit, wore a talis. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I've been going around speaking over the last couple of years about Rashi and his daughters, and it really gives me a kick when I walk into, usually it's a conservative synagogue, and I go to use the ladies' room, and there outside the door is a rack saying, "Women, remember to hang up your talis before you use the ladies' room." How long ago would you have never seen such a sign? Now it's assumed that they're going to that women are going to be wearing this, and that they need to need to hang it up. I mean, they're literally the sign of the times. And it's taken quite a fight as women have reclaimed this. But women in Rashi's time, as I said, some of them wore tefillin, some of them wore tzitzit. Women in Rashi's time, some of them women were blowing the shofar. Women sat in the sukkah and took the lulav, other time-bound mitzvot that women are considered exempt from. I discovered that women in Rashi's time were doing ritual circumcisions. They were mohalot. I also found that there's indications women in Rashi's time had aliyah to the Torah. I am learning all of these things that I could never have imagined that women in medieval times were doing this. I thought we're fighting so hard and working so hard for women to start doing these mitzvot that men have always claimed for themselves. Yet 900 years ago, there were women doing them in Ashkenaz. And I started, what happened to Jewish history? Why does no one teach about these things? Why is this information not available? It's like the whole of Jewish history is what they call, you like to think, I think it's Sal Baron who says the lachrymose history of the Jews. What I like to say is the oive Jewish history. We were slaves in Egypt. The first temple's destroyed and we sent to Babylon. The second temple's destroyed. We're sent everywhere. Then we're expelled from Spain. Then there's the Holocaust. And wait a second, what happened to the thousands of years in between this time? Were there any good times? Were there times where Jews were actually prosperous and advancing Jewish civilization? Well, Rashi's time, which actually has a name in history, the 12th century Renaissance. And I'm not going to ask who's ever heard of the 12th century Renaissance, but I sure hadn't. I thought there was only one. But there was such a thing. It's a time period when the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims actually studied and worked together, translating the texts from the Greeks that had been lost. All of a sudden, Aristotle, Ptolemy, all the great Greek philosophers are being available into the medieval world. And I discovered also that not only was it women who were doing things that I had never imagined were happening in the Middle Ages, the Jewish society in general was nothing like what I imagined. Typically, if you think of the Jews in the Middle Ages, you think of blood libel and horrible anti-Semitism and Jews living in ghettos and Jews being restricted to only being money lenders and just, all kinds of horrible stuff. But all of those things, none of them apply to Rashi's time. There is almost no organized anti-Semitism. There is certainly no church anti-Semitism in Rashi's time. The church is way too busy with its own life, its own problems. In 1054 is when the split between what becomes the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, and the Latin Church, that split is in 1054. And so the church is working very hard to heal it. Little do they know that it will only get worse and worse, but they're focused on that. You also have at this time the church is trying to decide what is in the church as a philosophy and what is outside the church as heresy. And they're very focused on all the different groups that make up the church and deciding what's in and what's out. This is also the time of the Gregorian reforms. And by that, I don't mean the Gregorian calendar. Pope Gregory, a man who truly knew how to make friends and influence people, he's the guy who decided that clergy must be celibate. That was a surprise to me. I thought in the Catholic world that's how it was. No, at this time only the monks have to be celibate. The priests, the bishops, the archbishops, they can have wives, they can have mistresses, they can have boyfriends, and some all three. And when he decides that they all need to be celibate, you can imagine how happy the clergy were with him. As if this wasn't enough, he's also going against the secular lords and who appoint the abbots and the bishops. This is feudal times when everybody is a vassal of somebody on top of them. And he says the church needs to appoint these people. When the local duke appoints a bishop, he appoints someone, his cousin or someone who bribed him or someone who's not spiritually interested, which was indeed true. And the Pope says the church needs to be appointing these people. Of course, when the church appointed them, they appointed their cousins and people who bribed them, and etc. So the secular lords were not very happy, to put it mildly. I mean, they want their vassals to be obedient to them, loyal to them, not loyal to some guy in Rome. And so King Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, who has the power to appoint the Pope, he deposes Pope Gregory, and he appoints another Pope. Pope Gregory does not take this laying down. He excommunicates King Henry and appoints another king. You have popes and anti-popes, kings, anti-kings, half of Europe excommunicating the other half. Nobody cared what the Jews were doing, believe me. And what were the Jews doing, actually? The Jews were doing very well, thank you very much. They were not like Shylock with buckets of gold doubloons that everyone borrowed money from but it despised. The Jews were merchants. They were predominantly long-distance merchants. They sold on credit, just like your gas company and Nordstrom's and whatever other stores you buy stuff from with plastic. They sold on credit also. And they had a perfect niche of being merchants because you had the eastern lands under the Muslims with their silks and their spices and perfumes and jewels and just all kinds of good, wonderful stuff that they have in the East. You have the western lands, the Christian lands, with wheat and wool and wine and wood, actually, that the other side wanted. So the East wanted what the West had. The West wanted what the East had. But the East and West, first of all, spoke different languages. Here's a piece of trivia for you. In Rashi's time, there are 4 written languages in Europe: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, each with their own alphabet. French, Spanish, English, all that stuff is not being written down yet. That's part of what happens in the 12th century Renaissance. And if you've ever seen Shakespeare, how the language is crazy and the spelling is crazy, it's because he took a spoken language English, put it to the Latin alphabet, and did the best he could. So the Jews are speaking and writing Hebrew. That is not a dead language for them. They are writing their business contracts in Hebrew. They are using the Hebrew number system to do their accounting, which immediately gave them a huge advantage over the Christian world, which is still using Roman numerals. And the Jews, wherever they go on the trading route, they find other Jews who will give them hospitality, who will trust them implicitly, who will give them very useful information. There's pirates here, don't go there. There's famine here, sell your wheat. And so the Jews essentially had a monopoly on long-distance trade at this time. And they were so prosperous. As a matter of fact, the Jews in Troyes, where Rashi lived, were so prosperous, even the poorest Jewish families had servants. So we have a time period that in a way is like today, a very tolerant society, the Jews in lots of different occupations, not too much anti-Semitism. And like today, women are stepping up to want to do the men's mitzvot. They're wanting to do what the men are doing in synagogue. They're going to synagogue as often as the men. They all have servants. They're not home cooking and cleaning and changing diapers. They are out in society and very active in society. And so they are taking on the men's mitzvot. And I won't say they're getting away with it. Essentially in the Machzor Vitri, which is one of my primary sources compiled by Rashi students, when they talk about the women doing the men's mitzvot, and they're arguing whether women should say the blessings when they do it, because the Hebrew blessing when you do a mitzvah says b'mitzvah tov, who commands us. And some of the rabbis said the women aren't commanded to do these things. They're exempt. They shouldn't say the blessing. But Rabbeinu Tam, who is Rashi's grandson and the greatest rabbi of his generation, says b'mitzvah tov means who commands us, the Jewish people. Anybody who does a mitzvah must say the blessing, and that includes women. So he ended that argument. So the women, as I said, I was astonished to discover what women were doing in their society. Even more amazing than their role in the religious sphere was their role and power within Jewish marriage. More power and status than Jewish women have today, particularly in Israel, where the rabbinate rules over the marriage laws. There were 3 changes in Jewish law that happened in Rashi's time to give women more power in their marriage. The first one says that a Jewish man can only have one wife at a time. Well, that's not what the Torah says. Abraham has 2 wives, Jacob has 4. Even when the state of Israel was formed, there were Jews from the Sephardic lands came with more than one wife. But in Ashkenaz, where Rashi lived, they changed the law. Jewish man only gets one wife. Then another law they changed was divorce. According to the Torah, a man finds something unseemly in his wife. He gives her a divorce. He writes her the get, gives her the divorce. The marriage is over. That's it. Well, they changed that. They said the Jewish man cannot divorce his wife without her consent. If she does not agree, no divorce. The third one, and this is the one when I spoke in Israel, the women were very excited, because this is the one that they've lost. There was a mechanism in Rashi's time for Jewish women to divorce their husbands. And we do not have that in modern halakha. What women did, if they wanted a divorce, would be to go to the Beit Din. And there was a stock phrase. In California, if you want to get divorced, it doesn't matter what the reason is. We all say irreconcilable differences. Well, they did the same thing in Rashi's time. If a woman wanted a divorce, she went to the court and she says, I find this man repulsive. I can no longer live with him. The court replies, no one should have to share a basket with a snake. And they turn to the man. They say, write her the get, give her the divorce. And if the man didn't want to, if he was recalcitrant in any way, they threatened him with cherem, with excommunication. And in a Jewish world where the man's livelihood depends on buying and selling and trading with other Jews, if he is excommunicated, no Jew will speak to him, no Jew will even come 10 feet from him. He is out of business. That's it. And all the responses I studied, I never found a case where a Jewish man refused to divorce his wife. You actually have an imbalance. The man cannot divorce his wife unless she says agrees. But if she wants a divorce, he must divorce her whether he agrees or not. And this was so amazing to me, the power that women had. Actually, the reason, I have some water here. I think the reason that the power in marriage changed was, well, partly for a good reason, partly for a not so good reason. The good reason is that women had a lot of power in the community. They had a lot of status. While the men were gone doing buying and trading, the women were perhaps doing their trading in the house, keeping the inventory, keeping the accounts. They were very necessary business partners. But I think it was mostly for a not so good reason that women had this power. Think of our matriarchs in the Bible, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Rachel dies in childbirth, 1 out of the 4 of them. 1 out of 4 women dying in childbirth has pretty much been the ratio from ancient times till modern medicine. And I'm appalled to tell you that in Afghanistan and parts of Africa today, 1 out of 6 women still die in childbirth. Well, in the Christian world where the monks don't marry and the younger sons of nobility without land don't marry, it didn't matter that you had more men than women. But in the Jewish world, where the first mitzvot is be fruitful and multiply, where it is incumbent on a Jewish man to marry and have children. If there's more men than women, there's a problem. Well, at least there's a problem for the men. The women have a buyer's market. And society changed to reflect the fact that women had the power really to choose their husbands and to have a say in their marriage. Anyway, I'm learning all this amazing stuff about women. You notice I have said nothing about writing a book yet, because I did research for a couple of years before the idea even occurred to me. Or actually, maybe a better way to say it is something possessed me to write about this time period. I think it came partly from just all the interesting stuff I was studying, and I'm telling people about it, and I'm wanting people to know. And somehow, if I ever get on Oprah, I'm going to have to come up with some better explanation, because honestly, I can't remember that a certain day, like a light bulb goes off in the cartoon, and I decided I'm going to write a book. For 30 years, I was a clinical chemist at Kaiser Permanente. I never wrote anything in my life before Rashi's Daughters, except maybe love letters to my husband when he was in the army. I did not pick up a crayon in kindergarten and say, I'm going to be an author when I grow up. But I wanted this information to get out there. And somehow I had the incredible, whether it's chutzpah or naivete, that I was going to write a trilogy of novels about them. Rashi had 3 daughters, so it made sense, a trilogy. And we actually knew the names of Rashi's daughters. So there was going to be book 1, Joheved, book 2, Miriam, book 3, Rachel, for the 3 daughters. And there were some books that really influenced me because I loved fiction. That's how I decided I'm going to write novels. First of all, I'm not a rabbi. I don't have a PhD. Who would buy a nonfiction book with my name on it? And also, fiction is what I love to read. This is my favorite kind of books. I read historical fiction, murder mysteries, science fiction, any kind of fiction, you name it. My husband reads the stuff on the right side of the bestseller list. The long tail, the word is flat, things like that. And now, of course, I read lots of nonfiction, but none of them are on the bestseller list. They're all medieval manuscripts. So I decided I'm going to write the book that I want to read. Let's face it, if I didn't want to read it, why would anyone else want to read it? And I thought of books that were going to really influence me. The first one, actually, that I already mentioned was The Chosen. And that influenced me in kind of a negative way. And I'm assuming everybody here has read The Chosen. I'm not going to embarrass you to raise your hands. But the whole premise of The Chosen and its sequel are about the Talmud world and the world of studying in the yeshivot, and who's entitled to teach and who's entitled to come up with the right text, and the politics of the yeshiva. Everything takes place about studying Talmud, but there's not one word of Gemara in there. There is no Talmud at all in any of Chaim Potuk's books. And I said, Rashi's claim to fame, he's the great Talmud scholar. The daughters' claim to fame, they studied Talmud when women weren't supposed to do this. There is going to be Talmud in my books. And those of you who have read 1 or 2 already know that there's at least 15 different sugya, Talmud passages scattered throughout, that when Rashi's teaching his daughters or his students, you're in the room with them. And I could tell you those were the hardest parts to write of the whole book, because these are novels. They're supposed to be action. There's supposed to be a plot. You can't just dump, like a couple of pages of Talmud in the middle of a novel. It's going to stop the action dead. And assuming people didn't skip over to like the next page, they'd probably just put it down and that's the end of it. So I had to find Talmud that was interesting. I wanted to share how exciting and how enjoyable Talmud was for us, or at least for me, and to weave it into the plot so that it would really belong there. And frankly, a stealth reason also for writing these books and for including the Talmud in there is because I want to encourage more liberal Jews, more Jewish women to study Talmud. Jewish law is made by, men in black coats sitting around a table someplace from which there are no women at that table. And women are not at that table because we don't have that knowledge. But I see it changing so much in the last 10, 15 years. Drisha's just the start, the women's yeshivot, the Jewish high schools that are teaching Talmud to the girls the same as to the boys. For Rashi's 1000th birthday, I would almost guarantee you that there are going to be a whole generation of women who know exactly as much Talmud as the men. And when we have that knowledge, we will have a place at that table. And I really hope I live that long to see what it's going to do to the Jewish world when you have this generation, critical mass of Jewish women who really know all their texts. All right, political announcement on the side. So, okay, I know it's not, there's going to be Talmud in it. Great. That doesn't tell you much. So I needed a plot. I know there's some fiction that doesn't appear to have a plot, but I felt I'm writing novels. They should have a plot. And I'm in New York, so I bet a lot of you are familiar with this children's series by Sidney Taylor, the All of a Kind Family children's books. For those of you who aren't, it takes place, they were written about 50, 60 years ago, takes place in the Lower East Side, the turn of the century around 1900, family with 4 or 5 daughters. The plots are pretty minimal, but over the course of the books, you learn how the Jewish family lived, how they ate, how they dressed, how they did all the life cycle events, how they did all their holidays, and you really learned how that whole culture worked. And that's what I wanted to do for 11th century Troyes. You're going to live with Rashi's family. You're going to learn everything they did, all the holidays and all the foods, everything. But this was not going to be a children's book. And for those of you who have read book 1, you know it is not a children's book. There's 2 things. I mean, if you were thinking to get Rashi's daughters as a bat mitzvah present for someone, adult bat mitzvah. Rashi's daughters is R-rated. Some people would say X-rated, depending on your valuation of that. I wrote the book I wanted to read, remember. But I also wrote the explicit sex scenes, which there certainly are in there, as part, not just because I thought, it's going to help me sell lots of copies, but believe me, all this, the stuff that's in the Talmud is some of it even more explicit than what I wrote. And this was instrumental to the plot, actually. Our heroine, Joheved, and her husband, Meir, have 6 incredible children. 4 of their sons are scholars. 2 of them are the greatest scholars of the next several generations. Even one of their daughters is learned. And in the Talmud, there are sections that say the quality of a child is proportional to the quality of the sex act that conceives that child. The better the sex, the better enjoyment for man and woman, the better the child that will be born from that. There's even sections in the Talmud that talk about what's wrong with people and trace it back to what their parents did wrong in bed. And it's actually things that we would probably agree with, like they were drunk, or they'd been fighting, or they were thinking of someone else. My favorite, one of them was asleep. In any case, if Joheved and Meir have these 6 fabulous children, any one of whom most Jewish parents would love to have, then clearly they had the hottest sex in the millennium in order to produce these children. And if they had great sex, I'm a romantic, they must love each other, voila, the plot is a romance. Girl meets boy, girl gets boy, girl loses boy, girl gets boy. I mean, it made sense, actually, because it wasn't going to be a heroic quest, and it wasn't going to be a murder mystery, and it wasn't going to be revenge. I think there's only 6 plots for all books that are novels anyway. But so the Talmud actually informed me on how the plot was going to be. And so I started in 1997, more chutzpah and more naivete. I actually outlined all 3 books at the start of writing, not having any idea what I was going to get into. And I had the various themes. And book 1 is going to be like the fairy tale and the introduction. And as I said, the classic romance, girl meets boy, girl gets boy, etc. And it will introduce you to the society and the family and who Rashi is and Talmud. And it would be the closest to, I don't want to say reality, because all of my books I try to be as accurate as possible, but it's the closest to historically what we know of these people. When it came time for book 2, which is the one that was just published this last August, I decided I'm ready to look really at archetypes. And since we don't know that much about Miriam, Rashi's second daughter, other than she was his second daughter, I decided I'm going to make Miriam a midwife. And here's the difference between being a historian and being a historical novelist. A historian must be right. historical novelist cannot be wrong. In other words, they didn't invent forks till the 1400s, so I don't have Rashi's family eat with forks. But as long as no one can prove that Miriam was not a midwife, and it seems highly likely that, she was a woman. If I'd made Rashi a midwife, then people could complain. But I decided I'm making Miriam a midwife because I've discovered a lot of research, interesting stuff about how they did obstetrics in those days and the herbs, and they were really far more advanced in terms of contraception and early abortions, that we could use some of the herbal remedies that they seem to have perfected back then. So I decided I'm going to make her a midwife, and then I'm going to make her a mohelet. I'm going to make her the one doing ritual circumcisions, because it's such an amazing thing that some women in those days were. And this will bring conflict with her in the community, and et cetera. The kind of thing all books need is conflict that the character has to overcome. And I thought then, to make things more interesting, and this is in 1997. Okay, now's the time when I have to pull out my little, all right, this pocket. There they are, my little candies. Usually I ask when I have a room full of Jewish women, somebody in their purse is going to open, has these little candies they open up and make lots of noise for your, to be able to stop coughing. But this time I actually supplied mine. Actually, I spoke to 300 Hadassah ladies at lunch today. So when I started, getting a sore throat and asked for some of these lozenges, like all of a sudden there's 30 of them in front of the, and I still have them in my pockets. One of the things I learned, I'm keeping track of my time because I want to make sure I tell you the most interesting thing that I learned in all my research before I finish. But in studying with Rachel, another thing I learned in a women's Talmud class, she points out to us how the yeshiva world, the Talmud world, what a homosocial world it is, that it's all men. These guys are separated from their wives, if they have wives. They are between like 16 and 20-something years old, the height of their libido and hormones. They're studying Talmud, holy texts in Havruta, intimate study partner relationship. You couldn't have picked a better situation, or worse situation, depending on your attitude, in which the yeshiva students are going to fall in love with each other. Any guy who has the slightest tendency of attraction for another man, this is going to be the place to excite it. She pointed out the various pairs in the Talmud who clearly had very passionate feelings for each other. And I decided I'm going to explore that also in book 2. Because certainly in the medieval times, well, even more so in the medieval times, because they still very much had the attitudes of Rome and Greece, where it was considered perfectly normal and acceptable, even encouraged, for men to be attracted to other men. And we have Hebrew poetry, talking about very handsome youths and beautiful maidens. A young man or a young woman could be equally attractive. And this was considered perfectly normal. Okay, for the two men to have sex together was a sin, but adultery was a sin. That doesn't mean it wasn't normal for someone to find another man's wife attractive. The attitude was very different than today, or at least, let's say, 10 years ago. Today, things are changing very rapidly. But for them, the desire was normal. The action was a sin, but not a crime. And so I found that kind of amazing, the toleration that there was in that time for what we would consider queer attitudes. Little did I know in 1997 that when that book finally got published in 2007, that this would be the cause célèbre in the Jewish community, in so many religious communities. What are we going to do with clergy that are falling in love with each other? But I decided that was going to be the plot, or at least what I would look at in broad terms, and my characters would struggle with this. Book 3, there I didn't have to invent a plot, because during the time period of book 3, the First Crusade happens. And so there are going to be a lot of interactions between Jews and Christians and how that influenced them all. Since I just got my 5-minute warning, and I know you guys are going to have questions, I'm going to tell you the most fascinating piece of information I found in all my research. And believe me, I found tons of interesting stuff. For me, I'm not doing research in order to write the book. I'm writing the books as an excuse to do all the research, which is what I love to do. So I told you how the women were doing the men's mitzvot, how they were blowing the shofar and wearing tefillin and doing circumcisions. But of course, in the Jewish world, we have some women's mitzvot. We have a few things that women are commanded to do. And the classic, most popular, certainly the one that everyone's most familiar with nowadays, is lighting the Shabbat candles. Well, in Rashi's time, not only did they not have candles, those are a later invention, they didn't have this ritual either. Or at least they're just starting to have this ritual. In Rashi's time, there is a big controversy and debate over what the woman should do when she lights the lamp on Friday afternoon. Because there is no place in the Torah that says, thou shalt light a lamp on Friday afternoon. In the Talmud, there is no description of the ritual. There is certainly no blessing. There is no injunction you have to do it. There is nothing to indicate this is anything other than a practical matter. That Wednesday and Thursday night you can light the lamp whenever you like. But on Friday, because lighting fire on the Sabbath is forbidden, you have to light it before sunset. There is certainly no special lamp. This is the same household lamp they use all the time. But somehow, and this is an amazing thing to contemplate, lighting the lamp on Friday afternoon for women in Rashi's time is becoming a holy act. It is becoming sanctified for them. It is becoming a religious ritual. And by this time, Rashi at least knows enough about it that he says, and he's the first one to call lighting the Shabbat lamp a mitzvah. In Tractate Shabbat, he says lighting the Shabbat lamp, lighting the Hanukkah menorah, these are mitzvot, and whoever does them brings the light of Torah into our homes. He doesn't say anything about a blessing. 2 generations later, Rabbeinu Tam, the same guy that said women are supposed to make blessings if they're doing the men's mitzvot, he says whoever lights the Shabbat lamp, this is a mitzvah, and they must say the blessing. But he doesn't give you the blessing. You have no idea what he's talking about, because it's not in the Talmud, and you're not actually allowed to make up new blessings. You're only allowed to use the ones in the Talmud. So the person he was writing to may have known, but someone didn't know what the blessing was, and they wrote a response, a legal question, not to Rabbeinu Tam, but to his sister, Hannah. They knew Rabbeinu Tam is in synagogue on Friday afternoon. They want to know what a woman really does. They're not going to ask a guy. They ask her, what did your mothers do? We want the most authoritative Jewish women in medieval Ashkenaz. These are Rashi's daughters. What did they do about the Shabbat lamp? She writes back and says, my mother in Rashi's house lit the lamp and said the blessing. And she actually writes down the blessing. Baruch atah, etc., lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. The exact same blessing that women say today. So where did she get this blessing? As we have it written down, they were saying it. Where did it come from? Well, you either get to think ahead a month or think back last year to Hanukkah. Yes, Hanukkah is like 5 weeks away, which is astonishing. Think of lighting the menorah, where the blessing for doing that is Baruch atah, etc., lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. The exact same blessing, one word different. And what somebody did, and personally I think it was a woman, but of course we don't know. And I must admit I did not have the chutzpah to have Rashi's daughters invent this. I was sure that someone would, if there was anything out there that proved they didn't, someone would find it. And actually someone did find it, so I was very glad I hadn't written it down. But I still think it was a woman. Maybe during Hanukkah, she's lighting the lamp on Shabbat after she just lit the menorah. And she's feeling some holy feeling, I don't know what, to take someone into this spiritual space. And she says a blessing lighting the lamp. We know that by 100 years later, women everywhere are saying this blessing when they light the Shabbat lamp. It even spreads into Egypt, into Sephardim, because someone writes a responsa to Maimonides asking him, the women are saying this stuff when they light the lamp. What are, on Shabbat? It's not in the Talmud. What are you going to do? And he says, it's a nice minhag. If they want to do it, it's okay. Believe me, it is not a mitzvah for the women of Sephardim, but they are doing it. And here we are 900 years later. I was totally astonished. I assumed the Shabbat blessing was the original. I assumed Hanukkah came from there. But no, the Hanukkah blessing is 500 years older than the Shabbat blessing. I thought the Shabbat blessing must be in the Torah, must have come on Sinai. Sarah said it in her tent. I don't know. But I never imagined that the Hanukkah came first and the Shabbat came later, and that women wanting to say a blessing when they lit the Shabbat lamp was a source of huge controversy for like a couple hundred years before it finally settled in to something that everybody says now and everybody assumes is always there. So imagine 900 years from now. Maybe Jews will think there's always been bat mitzvahs. Maybe they'll think that Jewish women have always studied Talmud. Maybe they'll even think there's always been women rabbis. Women rabbis. So ask your questions. I think I'm on time. Way in the back. Okay. Well, actually, it's very different for the three daughters. What is the source of information about Rashi's daughters? What is there actually out there for them specifically, as opposed to Jewish women in Ashkenaz in general? Is that your question? Okay. For Rashi's youngest daughter, Rachel, we know very little. She doesn't have any sons who become great scholars of the level of the other ones. And frankly, most of what we know about Rashi's daughters was not written by Rashi. It was written by their sons. So about Joheved, whose two sons, Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam, were quite prominent, we have a lot of information. Those of you who read book 1 realize that I made Joheved's husband's family feudal lords, because indeed they were. They talk about how they raised sheep and wheat and had vineyards. And in feudal times, if you had sheep, wheat, and vineyards, my goodness, you had a lot of land. And if you had land, you were a feudal lord. And I found in response that there were plenty of Jews who were feudal lords. This is how they got paid for providing all these great luxuries to the to the higher up feudal lords. They didn't give them money. They gave them a village and an estate for income for them. So I actually know a whole lot more about Joheved and her life and Meir and where they live. You can even go to Troyes, the town out to Ramaru, and see where they lived. Miriam, we know less. We know a bit about her descendants, but I didn't know. I knew that one of Rashi's daughters stayed in Troyes and taught Torah to the other women there. And I knew that Joheved was living in Ramaru, so that's probably Miriam, but I didn't know that much. Rachel the least. But I did know that there are certain stories that happen they talk about one daughter, like a daughter who put the milk spoon in the meat pot. I don't know which one it was, but Rashi students write about it. In book 2, where Rachel loses payment, that's a down payment for wine. That's actually real. We know that happens. And all I know, it was the youngest daughter that this happened to. So therefore, it must have been Rachel, even though it never named her. So there are lots of responsa and lots of things collected by Rashi's students about his family and about life in his household that I could use, even though I wasn't sure necessarily which daughter it applied to. That'll say enough, but generally I had to extrapolate a lot just from society. I don't know whether Rashi specifically taught them or whether they listened from another room. How exactly they got learned, this we don't know. Yes?
I have a comment and a question which are not related. First of all, women have always been studying Talmud in academic institutions. I took advanced studies thought at the University of Rochester in 1971. There were plenty of women in my class, maybe not in religious institutions.
Right.
They'd always take it in religious studies for studying their book. But my other point was that the great book, Born to Rebel by MIT statistician, looking at birth order and shift gender on pioneering
Mm-hmm.
He showed that the women who move on male worlds and had male in medicine and law, to use as examples, are always women in all-female fiction, which is exactly an example of this. Now, were there other women in that time period who were more pioneering and progressive and moving things forward, or was it specifically, do you think, these women in this unique circumstance where they're in all-female fiction, like the William?
Certainly, whenever she's asking about all-girl families and how these are always the one where women are going into the men's world and doing the men's stuff. And she's wondering, and certainly Rashi's family is a classic example of that. But you're wondering if their society is somewhat different, and we have other women who perhaps weren't in that. Who,
Women who were also pioneering in that time period from other families.
okay, I don't. Other than Rashi's daughters, and what we know about them is legend anyway. Clearly, it was more women than just Rashi's daughters, because you don't have women wearing tefillin and women doing circumcision. I mean, Rashi's daughters didn't do it in every town in Ashkenaz, so other women are doing it. So I think it was more of a broader society place that women actually had high status. Certainly throughout Jewish tradition, the women who study the holy texts, the women who are the most learned, are almost inevitably from all-girl families. Although sometimes they are the wives of very prominent rabbis who get taught by their husbands. But generally, if you don't have sons, and partly, well, not partly, exactly. I mean, the commandment, you shall teach them to your children. If you're a Jew who prays in synagogue, you are saying this 3 times, with the Shema, you're saying this a couple of times a day. And of course, all the English versions, even the most Orthodox, will translate this as children, but the Hebrew word is sons, because sons being, there isn't a gender neutral word for children in Hebrew. It's all gendered language. So generally the masculine plural includes feminine and masculine. But for reasons that if you read my book, you'll get Rashi's commentary on it, they chose to translate that B'nechem as only sons. Only sons. You are only obligated to teach Torah to your sons. But there were some places in the Jewish world that felt you could also translate this as children. And if you didn't have any sons, a man without sons was commanded by God to teach at least one of his children. And so these people taught their daughters. So there's always been hidden away in families, particularly where you had a very learned father with no sons, women who secretly studied, but their names don't come down to us for the most part. We're only lucky on Rashi's daughters because they had such illustrious sons that we know about them. If it was only to Rashi, you would have no idea he had any children at all. It's the next generation. The nice Jewish boys talk about their mothers is really how we know about them. Yes. That's the last barrier. She's surprised I found anything about Rashi's daughters wearing tefillin. Interestingly enough, when I was trying to find out, did they really do it, I could not even track down the source of the rumor, of the legend. The furthest back I could get that Rashi's daughters wore tefillin was in the 1700s, yet... Okay, now if you Google Rashi's daughters, of course, you're going to find all my stuff. But if you looked up for stuff about Rashi's daughters 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you would inevitably find they were learned and reputed to wear tefillin. You ask people, all kinds of people in the Orthodox world who never heard of Rashi's daughters, except they were learned and reputedly wore tefillin. And it's amazing because tefillin is like the last bastion of the men's mitzvot that women really haven't started doing a lot. Women wear wear talis as much as a man. Women here that go on synagogue on not on Passover, on Rosh Hashanah, they hear the shofar just like the men. A lot of women go into the sukkah. They've taken over pretty much all of the mitzvot, the time-bound ones they're exempt from. Tefillin seems to be the last one out there. But frankly, I guess in the non-Orthodox world, nobody does tefillin. As men don't do it, or women don't do it. So it's been equally neglected. But tefillin is the hardest to track down in Rashi's time because nobody wore tefillin outside of their house. You did not wear tefillin in the street. You did not wear tefillin in the synagogue. You would not tell a Jew outside their home from the Christian. They all dressed the same. They looked the same. They did everything the same. So the only people who would know if Rashi's daughters wore tefillin would be their immediate family. Frankly, the only people who would know that Rashi wore tefillin, if for some reason you wanted to know for sure, would be his immediate family. And the interesting thing, and excuse me if we're getting too detailed here on you want the answer, in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, we have some Tosafot by Rashi's grandson, Joheved's son, they start talking about women blowing the shofar, and all of a sudden he's saying that women who do these time-bound mitzvot must say the blessing, and he talks about women wearing tefillin, that they must say the blessing. And I'm wondering, why drag tefillin into this? You could talk about the shofar. Women are blowing the shofar. But the point is, Rabbeinu Tam is Yoheved's son. If anybody had seen their mother wearing tefillin, it would have been him. So he's talking about tefillin because he's seen his mother wear tefillin. He knows she says the blessing. That's the closest evidence we can get to whether Rashi's daughters really wore it. But it's certainly interesting that in talking about shofar, he's talking about tefillin when he talks about these things. So that's the closest I can get you. I would love to find some real historical evidence that one of them actually did. Yeah, right, exactly. That's always the thing. Michal and Rashi's daughters wore tefillin. Yes, in the red. Oh, yeah, okay. She's asking documentation for hanging tefillin in the birthing room. There are many superstitions and I don't want to say Baba Mises because they didn't have Yiddish. Rashi did not speak Yiddish. He didn't know from Yiddish. A lot of superstitious stuff, as my study partner likes to call these, Kabbalistic stuff. But demons and astrology and lucky days and unlucky days and just all of the medieval superstitions that the Jews believed in was frankly part of the most fun stuff to research and to put in there. And one of them, of course, because childbirth was so dangerous, there was an amazing amount of superstitions and demonology that developed out of that. Lilith being the classic demon who is attacking new mothers and new children. And the Jews marshaled all of their defenses that they could against it. And they had special amulets for childbirth, which I was astonished to see when I was in Israel last winter on an author tour. You can buy these same amulets that they used in the Middle Ages with the names of the angels and things exactly like Joheved had. You can get them now. So I found in plenty of medieval text, you bring in tefillin. You would even bring a Torah scroll into the room where the woman is in labor as protection to keep the demons away. And someone has to be with her all the time. There are certain psalms that are recited constantly. It's almost like over a dead body. You don't leave alone and you're reciting psalms. Same thing, woman in childbirth. There's particular pieces of the Torah that you say during a childbirth to encourage the woman, to protect her from demons, and just sympathetic magic. One of the classic things they whisper to the woman in labor is sections from Exodus. You're going out. God took them out. Like, okay, that makes sense. As opposed to some of these other magic stuff that makes no sense, but they just were ancient things. But most of the demonology, all the superstitions in my books are straight from the Talmud. People ask me, how could Rashi believe such stuff so learned? Well, because it's all from the Talmud. The more that he knew from the Talmud, the more of these things he would have been aware of and was worried about. Yes. Okay, all of the potions came from real medieval documents. And this is one of the things that has really helped me, and the perfect timing of this is in the last 10 or 20 years, as women take their place in academia and become professors and assistant professors, they have to publish and perish like the men. So it means they are they have to do research into areas that nobody has looked at before, hopefully. And many of them are looking into women's history because men never did. So there's a lot of women's history, women's stuff that has just been having research done in the last 10 or 20 years. And so there have been 4 medieval obstetric manuals translated in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, some of them just a couple of years. And, the recipes for the potions, there's women who were researching, could they really work for contraception? Did women know how to do abortions? It's clear that women they limited their children somehow. If you do cemetery studies, you can tell that there's the right number of children to match all the people, and the number of babies also. They somehow, if you had all the children you could have, you would see different age groups in the cemeteries. And so they've looked at some of these medieval manuals and they say, wow, these potions, for example, to bring on a woman's flowers, and excuse me, for those of you who didn't read book 1, flowers was the French medieval word for a woman's menstruation. Just as a fruit tree or grapevine must flower before it can be fruitful, so too a woman must flower before she can be fruitful. Isn't that better than the curse or the rag? I mean, we need to bring back flowers. I mean, anyway, the word is in French is fleur, which works as a noun or a verb. And that's the other kind of stuff I think was so cool. But in all of these books, there's been studies saying these really look like they might work for contraceptions or for an abortifact. They could also kill you. But the medieval women midwives who were prescribing these, they knew exactly how to make them so that they had the right amounts. When you read the instructions, it just says take, this plant and this wine and mix it and boil it. It doesn't tell you the amounts, but I'm sure they knew how to do this. And so the women's health items was just fascinating for me to research. And most of those have only come to light in the last 15 years. So a lot of the research that I'm doing is I'm really having to keep track of what the women scholars are coming up with because they're proving new things all the time. Yes. Some of the medieval stuff is actually like Old English or Old French, but most of it's mostly Latin. Trotula's in Latin. I did find a medieval Hebrew obstetric manual that was at UCLA's medical library. So of course that was in Hebrew. I mean, everything from those days has got to be either in Greek or Latin or Hebrew. I don't read Arabic, so forget that. I've done my personal research is done in English, in Aramaic, in Hebrew, and in French. I took French in high school, and it really came back to help because when I started doing research on the history of Troyes and what the counts are doing and what the people would be gossiping about, UCLA has this incredible amount of medieval French history books. There was a 7 set, I think it's a book, this many books, from the 1600s, the history of the counts of Champagne. I mean, how could you put that much of it? They only ruled for 300 years. And the vocabulary is so minimal that with a dictionary and my high school French, I could read all of that stuff. If you know how to say king, bishop, archbishop, knight, death, I mean, that's it. You can translate all these history books. There's not much. It's not like reading, Tolstoy in French. In Hebrew, the Talmud is written, the Mishnah is in Hebrew, the Gemara is in Aramaic. Rashi throws in a lot of French words in there using Hebrew letters. Yes, study it in those, and in English too, because it's interesting to see how everybody else translates these things. Okay, way on the... A lot of things have not been translated. They're there, but nobody has looked at them to translate them and to make a study of various kinds. Okay, No, I didn't find it. Someone decided to research this. Right. Like, for example, there's a huge trove of information about 11th and 12th century Sephardic Jews that came to light in the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza that was discovered like 100 years ago. And all of that material has been taken out of there, and it's in the British Museum, but only 10% of it has been translated and studied. 90% of this information is just waiting for somebody to write the check to hire the people who are the experts who can translate this, because it's Arabic written in Hebrew characters. So you really need some very specialized scholars to translate it. One of the things I discovered in USC, because there's somebody there who's really into Arab astronomy. And certainly the Muslim lands were way ahead of the Christian lands in terms of astronomy and science, and they had done a lot of research. Most of that has not been translated at all. It's still sitting there in Arabic. And this guy started translating it. And one of the things he discovered was that there were Arab astronomers who knew very well that the Earth was not the center of the universe. They had already, I mean, the thing that really confused them was that the moon goes around the Earth, but then the other planets go around the sun, and they knew that it couldn't possibly all be around the Earth. And some of them had actually suggested the true way that we have. And some of their wording, it appears that Copernicus may have plagiarized them, but just nobody had translated the Arabic. Somehow he got a hold of this, and he presents it as his own. I don't know if he presented it as his own, but he presents it, and he gets the credit for it. But it's way earlier in Arab astronomy texts, most of which are still someplace in Arabic, not read by our world. There was someone else, right? What? I've actually finished early. We've run out of questions. Aha, right. Look for Rachel. Okay, you can look for Rachel in fall of 2009. In between then, you can look for a YA version. They call YA young adult, but they don't mean young adults. They mean preteens for bat mitzvah. JPS, Jewish Publication Society, contracted with me to take book one, to take Joheved, and turn it into a book for, well, essentially take the sex out and shorten it a bit and turn it into a book that, 12 and 13-year-old girls could read, because really, especially the problem I had in trying to sell this book to a literary agent was, as you read first book one, at least, it starts when Joheved's 11. And so for the first, half of the book until she's married at 15, she's a teenager and I'm talking in her voice. And so it sounds like it's a YA version. Then they get to the wedding night and it's like, oh, this is not and they didn't know what to do with this book. So anyway, now there will be a YA version coming out next summer if you want to, have young people read it. And since we have a little bit of time for a few minutes, I'll tell you a little bit about my publishing saga, because for some people that's as interesting as the research that I did into Rashi's daughters. Okay, I told you I really wanted to have Joheved published in 2005, that this was my goal for Rashi's 900th yard site. But my literary agent had not found a publisher at that point. So my husband and I decided to start Benot Press, our own small press, in order to get Joheved out there. And some of you have the one with the red cover, the original Benot Press edition that we published. This is more, this is more chutzpah and naivete, because can you imagine, let's start our own press. At least I knew I had an audience, and I had a pretty good idea how to reach them. There's so many Jewish women's organizations out there, and they all have meetings every month, and they are looking for speakers, and I went out speaking. And by the end of 2 years, we were in our sixth printing, 26,000 copies out there. So certainly there was a market, and Jewish women were going for this. And I had gotten a foreign rights agent, because translating in other countries is something I could never imagine to do. And if some foreign country wants to do it, some foreign publisher, this is just gravy. They write me a check and I say, thank you. And they translate it into Italian or whatever. Well, my agent, my foreign rights agent, said, you're almost ready to have Miriam, go to you're starting to get ready to print it. Have you thought about selling the American rights? And I said, essentially, they'd have to make me an offer I couldn't refuse. I just couldn't even imagine that it would happen. 4 months later, she calls me back and she says, are you sitting down? Penguin, HarperCollins, and Crown are in a bidding war for the Rashi's Daughters series. And she said, you need to think about, do you really want to sell this? Do you want to keep publishing yourself? Do you want Benoit Press to do it? Do you want a publisher? You got to come up with, you were joking before, but now you got to think serious. That what would it take? And so discussions, with my family and my husband and my kids, what do I really want to do? Do I want to be a publisher? Do I want to just be the author? And I realized what I really want is for the world to know about these women, for the world to know about what life was like for Jews in this time period, that it was a good time period when Jews and Christians got along, when even Muslims got along. And I wanted it to get to the largest audience possible, that I was not necessarily in there to be like the Da Vinci Code and sell 5 gazillion copies. So I ended up, after questioning all the various companies, I ended up going with Penguin, with Plume. They certainly made me a very nice financial offer as well. And I said, you have to take book 1, because as long as Benoit Press is still doing book 1, what do I need with somebody else doing the other 2 books? I want the nice box set at the end kind of stuff. So now Penguin has reissued book 1. They put out book 2. And I went from, self-published researcher to Rashi's Daughters book 2 is on the BookScan bestseller list under the romance category, but okay, go figure. There isn't a Judaica category, so. And here I am talking at the 92nd Street Y. So if someone had told me 10 years ago, when I imagined the plot of these 3 books and that I was going to do this, and here I am where I was, I could never imagine it would happen. I have no idea how it happened. And I really thank you guys all for coming here and buying my books and being interested. What? Rachel, I'm up to chapter 17 of the first draft. So it is getting written. And speaking of writing, I will sign your books and I will inscribe them to whoever you want. And there's a guy from Barnes & Noble with copies in the back. Oh, sure. Why? I don't know what I'm doing after. I could barely think of that I'm going to have this happen. No, if Rashi's Daughters comes out really well and I still have research that I want to share, there might be Rashi's granddaughter.
Thank you all so much for coming. Books are available in the back. Thank you so much. I'm sure Maggie would be happy to answer more questions too.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.